About a year ago, I decided to try out Final Fantasy XIV. I'd had friends talk about it in the past and seen bits here and there online, but had just been putting it off since I first heard about the game around Heavensward. Well, I either had really good or really bad timing, because about 2 weeks after starting the free trial, my state went into lockdown at the start of the pandemic. I was pretty much finished with school and wasn't having to go into work, so I got instantly sucked in. I mean, for a few months after I graduated and was searching for jobs, I was playing nearly 12 hours a day, and I don't think I'd done that with a game since RuneScape in the mid-2000s. It was intimidating at first, but I made pretty quick work of A Realm Reborn and joined my first free company shortly after. Since then, I've done a little bit of everything, from finishing the Shadowbringers MSQ to gathering in the Diadem, and where I'm currently at, progging through the latest tier of Savage raids. In this video, I'm going to talk about what's kept me hooked in this game where other MMOs haven't really been able to, and what I think about the overall state of the game as we start moving towards Endwalker. So being a Final Fantasy title, it doesn't make sense to not talk about the story, so we're going to start there. Note that there will be some story spoilers here up through patch 5.4, so if you want to skip that, I'll add a timestamp down below to skip to the wrap up, which I'll try to keep spoiler free. So since I didn't start playing until 2020, I definitely missed the original iteration of the game and can't comment on really anything that happened in 1.0, so we'll just start with A Realm Reborn. I went into the game blind. I knew that there would be some pretty typical Final Fantasy type elements like crystals, gods, various empires, what have you. Other than that, everything about Hydaelyn was pretty unknown to me. On my first playthrough, it was really easy for me to get invested. I wanted to explore everything. I loved unraveling the little mysteries about what was going on with the primals, joining the scions, doing your general save the world kind of things. After I finished the main story for ARR, I learned that relic weapons existed and spent way too much time getting my blacksmithing to 50 so that I could make Cortana on my own. I really felt like I was becoming a part of this world that I had jumped into, and that by itself is a really big marker for success by my standards. After finishing my A Realm Reborn relic, I jumped into Heavensward, and I have to say that when I got there, I absolutely couldn't believe the huge jump in quality in the storytelling. Even after the rework in patch 5.4, A Realm Reborn has not aged that well. I thought it was fine on my first playthrough, or I wouldn't be talking about it here, but when I started going through it again a second time on an alt, I bought a story skip because I just couldn't slog through it again, especially knowing what was coming up next. Heavensward is, without a doubt, my favorite expansion in the game so far. The setting is a dream for a fantasy nerd with all the dark gothic architecture and the snow-capped mountains. The score has some of my favorite moments in the entire OST, and who doesn't want an expansion centered around fighting a war with dragons? I remember I was so hyped watching my Warrior of Light walk confidently forward to take on Nidhogg and end a war that had been going for more than 1,000 years. The emotional weight of this entire expansion is something that I hadn't really found in much fantasy media in several years now, and I don't think I'll ever forget that a smile better suits a hero. So moving on, I know that Stormblood isn't quite as popular with players as Heavensward or Shadowbringers. I know that a lot of people still hate on certain characters a fair bit, and generally it wasn't quite as impactful as the other expansions, but I still think that there's a lot to appreciate about it. For starters, Stormblood brought some of my favorite locations in the game. Places like Kugane and Yansha are a ton of fun to explore and gorgeous to look at, and it's really cool to have somewhere like the Azim Steppe and the Zayla Aura tribe based on real-world locations that we don't typically see a lot of references to in popular media. Each culture that we encounter in Othard is fully fleshed out and unique, and there's so much lore packed in there. My main character is a male Zayla, and seeing where his people come from and how they live was a really cool moment, made even cooler by the differences between them and the Ryan. Now, the story was definitely a bit flat in places, and I can see why certain characters aren't really liked. I really hope that they can find a way in 6.x to expand on Xenos in particular and make him a more compelling villain. That being said, I did enjoy the fight with Xenos at the end of the Alamigo dungeon, and the overarching plot of following Raoban and Lys as they led the resistance, and I'm really hopeful going into Endwalker that they'll be able to expand on a lot of these plot points from Stormblood and make us care more about what's happening there and happening in Garlemald. Something that I really wasn't expecting, even getting near the end of Stormblood, was going to another world. I don't know, maybe I should have seen it coming, but the Scions collapsing one by one, and then finally the Warrior of Light going to the first, were things that kept me on the edge of my seat. And that feeling continued most of the way through Shadowbringers. 5.x was just full of twist after twist that in hindsight I should have probably expected, at least to a degree, but really kept me hanging on to the story until the very end. The villains were a lot better than they had been previously, especially Emmett Selk, and it felt like the majority of characters we came across had some sort of purpose. I feel like the writing team for this expansion really learned a lot from Stormblood's weaknesses and worked to make up for those where they could. In terms of the set design, though, and I feel like this may be kind of controversial, I think that I personally enjoyed the settings of the first two expansions more than this one. There's some really standout locations in like Ilmeg and Raktika, but overall the landscapes through most of the expansion just didn't get me the same way as Ishgard or Yansha. This is completely personal preference though, and I think the story, bosses, and dungeons make up for it, and then some. Now that we've covered my thoughts on the story side of the game, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the actual gameplay. Before Final Fantasy XIV, I'd never played a real role-based MMO. RuneScape has their combat triangle of melee range magic, and Guild Wars 2 has different specializations you can choose based on tank damage or support, but both systems are very different from your traditional MMO party compositions like 14's tank, healer, 2 DPS. Because of this and a general love for paladins, I knew that I wanted to start the game as a gladiator. I figured that tanking would help me learn the game a bit faster without having to worry about too many rotations, and I loved it so much that now, 1,000 or more hours later, I'm still maining paladin. I've played most of the jobs in the game above level 50 and have played every role in some sort of higher end content, which brings me to my first comment on what I like about the gameplay. The job system. In games like Guild Wars and World of Warcraft, your character is tied to a specific class. From a world building standpoint, this makes sense to me. Your character spends their life honing their skills and perfecting their style of combat. Lore also often leads to only a single class per character making sense, and it works for those games. Sometimes they may have something like specializations or elite specializations, which helps offer some variety while leaving the core identity of the class alone. But this can also be a huge downside sometimes. In Guild Wars 2, after several hundred hours of the same few abilities, I wanted to try out something new and rolled up a new character, a Guardian. But now I had none of the map unlocked, I had none of the story completed, I couldn't go to Lion's Arch for anything, I couldn't even really play with the elite specs because I had to start collecting hero points from scratch again. This is fine and works for some people, but I was in grad school and only had a very limited amount of time to play most days. Final Fantasy XIV respects that a little bit more than other MMOs do. Sure, you still have to level a job from level 1, but you already have all of your other resources unlocked, you have the armory bonus, and some jobs start at a higher level, whether that's something like Dark Knight at 30 or Dancer at 60. Being able to swap jobs just by switching weapons lets you be more flexible when joining parties and helps to keep things fresh without having to completely restart the game, and this has been a huge part of what's kept me so interested. I'm also a really big fan of the way dungeons and raids are handled in 14. Encounters tend to be designed with a fair bit of clarity, and it's fairly obvious where you need to be going and what you need to be doing. Party compositions are kept simple but flexible, and each job is able to bring something unique to the encounter. Dancer brings plenty of party buffs, Paladins excel at protecting others, Samurai and Black Mage bring the big damage numbers. Actual fight mechanics can be challenging, but are mostly doable with a party finder group, and even the larger 24-person raids don't feel like they're dragging. I really like that in 8-person content, there's no filler. There's a bit in Alexander, but it's usually just the part that people are actually interested in. The boss. The last thing I'll comment on here is the world building. In an IP that's been around for as long as Final Fantasy XIV has, it's really difficult to keep the world building consistent and to keep expanding on it without feeling unnatural. In Pokemon, for example, the world building has been somewhat messy over the course of the series, especially early on. They just keep adding new regions and Pokemon seemingly out of nowhere, and while it's enjoyable, it's also obvious that when the series started there wasn't much planned past Johto. In 14, it's handled much better. Through Stormblood, we already know of these other nations. It's not like Doma, Garlemald, and Alamigo come up out of nowhere. We've heard about them before, we know they exist. Even in traveling to the first in Shadowbringers, we've established that these other worlds exist and what they are a long time ago in the post-Heavensward quests. Everything feels connected in some way, and like this is an actual world with history behind it. There's so much to explore and to see, and it feels like no matter how long you play this game, you're probably not going to see every little bit of it. So to recap everything we've been through, Final Fantasy XIV is a game that requires a lot of investment in the story. Even if all you want to do is raid and do endgame content, most of it is locked behind either the MSQ or side quests. Not everything is equally smooth. A Realm Reborn is rough to get through, especially the post-story quests leading into Heavensward, and there are definitely flat moments in every expansion we've had so far. The job system is a great way to respect the time your players have to invest in the game, giving experience boosts for subsequent battle classes and allowing players to swap between jobs at will really helps people to feel like they can play the game how they want. Dungeons and raids are fun and engaging, and ultimate tier content lets players that have been around the longest or worked the hardest feel like they can still make progress. I've loved the first year that I've spent in this game, and I'm really excited to see where it's going in the future. If you're not already playing Final Fantasy XIV, now is a really good time to start. We're approaching the last major patch before the next expansion drops, and millions of people are playing monthly. If you're unsure, the free trial is one of the biggest out there. You can play the game for free all the way through the first expansion to level 60. Thanks for checking out the video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, it really helps me out. Check me out on Twitch and let me know what kind of content you want to see in the future. I'll see you guys in the next one.